All right, chapter 40, lights out. Wednesday morning, when Mark was finished with his guard duty shift, he went home to get ready to go for Manny's daughter and family. He had a lot on his mind. His most significant concern at the moment was how the trip to Austin would go. They had practiced the convoy plan he and Gunny had come up with, and had even simulated a roadblock and the different ways that they could choose to deal with it. If this trip went well, and Mark prayed that it would, then they would go to Waco on Saturday. The president had given his semi-weekly speech last night, and Mark noticed a subtle difference in the leader's tone. He had urged those in shelters to stay there, and everyone, no matter where they were, to cooperate fully with those in charge. He warned that any civil disobedience, looting, or interfering with the government's plans to control this crisis would have to be dealt with severely, given the extraordinary circumstances. In the end, he praised the American citizens for pulling together in these difficult times, and he assured them that food and medicine would continue to be provided to all those in government shelters. Mark supposed that the men might just be tired, but it sounded as if he was almost desperate. Rodney was holding on, but he was still unconscious. Lisa was getting a little more optimistic about his chances, but said she'd feel a lot better once he woke up. Donna seemed to be doing better, and Lisa had been keeping her busy setting up their new hospital. Mark walked out to his Jeep with his FAL and a backpack with his spare magazines, ammo, and emergency supplies. The Jeep looked funny. Chaparro had welded together a louvered girl guard that would hopefully protect the engine compartment from gunfire. The windshield had been lowered, and a rest for a rifle had been mounted on the dash so the driver could theoretically shoot and drive at the same time. Mark's truck also looked different. It too had a new grill guard, and the stock bumper had been replaced with a huge heavy pipe in case they needed to ram through a blockade. Mark placed his weapon and pack into the Jeep, which would be the lead vehicle, and waited for the others to arrive. It wasn't long until Manny drove up in his Suburban with Chaparro's trailer on the back. He had Victor with him, who would drive the truck. Scott Simmons, Dwight Ritteman, and Joe Bagwell all walked up together. They would sit shotgun in the three vehicles that were already here. A moment later, Professor Petrie drove up in his Trans Am with Gunny in the passenger seat. They would bring up the rear of the convoy. The right side T-top had been removed, which would give the rider a 360-degree field of fire. They were taking the FRS radios to communicate. The men loaded up and headed out of the subdivision. Manny, Mark, and Gunny had selected the route they would use, which was made up of mostly back roads and minor highways. Unless something compelled them to change the route, they would come back the same way. This made the round trip about 50 miles further than the most direct way, but the men felt the lesser risk was worth the extra fuel. Mark took the lead, with Victor and Manny following about a minute behind. Ted stayed far enough back that he could barely see the trucks in front of him. His job was to keep someone from sneaking up behind them. If another vehicle tried to attack him, he would radio the trucks ahead, and they'd set up a quick ambush on the sides of the road, while Ted hauled butt up to them. Mark's job in front was to cautiously round all curves and top all hills, looking for any roadblocks or attack points. The truck and the Suburban would stay back until Mark gave them the all-clear sign. If the Jeep ended up in an ambush, Mark and Joe, his co-pilot, would shoot back out of the open Jeep while they backed out of the danger zone. The convoy would try to keep their speed to about 45 miles per hour. A little over halfway, Mark topped a small rise and saw several burnt-out cars at the bottom of the hill, where there was a bridge over a creek. Two were completely off the road, but one was about halfway out in his lane. He slammed on the brakes and had Joe radio for the others to stop. He was over 300 yards from the cars and couldn't see anyone. He thought it might be the same kind of roadblock Gunny had seen the other day, but the cars didn't seem positioned right. He pulled his binoculars out of his pack and looked the area over as well as he could. He still couldn't see anyone. He radioed back to the others what was going on. Gunny had the rest of the vehicles move to the top of the hill. He instructed Victor to watch behind them and the others to cover the Jeep. Then he told Mark to slowly drive down to the choke point and see what happened. Mark eased his CJ into first gear and then placed his FAL on the dash rest. Joe had one of the AKs at the ready. The hair on the back of Mark's neck stood up as he released the clutch, and the Jeep crept down the hill. It seemed an eternity passed with each second, as Mark wished his eyes had X-ray vision. When they were 50 or 60 yards from the burned-out wrecks, Mark suddenly stomped on the brakes. He still couldn't see anything dangerous, but his nose had picked up a scent that made him retch. He looked over at Joe and saw from the hand over his nose and mouth that the smell was equally offensive to him. What happened? What happened? Gunny's voice crackled over the radio. Something smells awful down here, Mark replied. Did you see anything? No, not yet. Move on across the bridge then. If when you get past the cars and still don't see anything, stop and we'll come on down. But be ready, Karate Man. If there's trouble after you pass them cars, haul ass on through and we'll give 'em hell from up here. Roger that, Gunny. Mark held his breath and slowly drove across the bridge and past the 3 cars. He drove another 40 yards and stopped. Fortunately, the wind was blowing from this direction and it kept the smell down to a tolerable level at this distance. Mark took a good look around and then gave clearance for the others to come down. He hopped out of the Jeep with his rifle and slowly walked back toward the cars. Gunny had instructed Victor and Scott to hold their position in the truck at the top of the hill and keep watch in both directions. The other 2 vehicles stopped at the bridge about the same time that Mark and Joe reached the first car. The 2 men looked into it. Joe was instantly sick. Mark, somewhat assisted by his previous experiences, but mostly because he had skipped breakfast, just gagged a couple times. Someone had piled several bodies into the car and set it on fire. Unfortunately, the fire must have burned out before it totally consumed them, and they were starting to decompose badly. Mark called Gunny and the others over and told them what was making the terrible stench. Gunny examined the cars for a few minutes while everyone else made their way back to the Jeep for a drink of water. Mark saw the old man approach the car and look at the bodies. He wasn't sure, but it appeared that even Gunny was struggling to keep his breakfast down. After a few minutes, the grizzled Marine hobbled to the others and gave his report. It looks to me like the ones in the car were manning this roadblock. Looks like they bit off more than they could chew. The cars are all shot up from the side like they was crossways in the road and not the front, like they would be if they was coming down the road. There are a couple old sawed-off shotguns and a 30-30 in the car with the bodies. The stocks are burned up, but you can still tell what they were. Whatever punched holes through those cars was bigger than some old scattergun or a cowboy rifle. Could have been a group like us coming through that didn't take too kindly to being hijacked, or it could have been a meaner group of MZBs. Whoever they weren't fiddle-farting around. All the bodies been shot at least 3 or 4 times. So what should we do, Manny asked. We go on, but be real careful, Gunny answered. Mark walked over to the trailer attached to Manny's Suburban and removed a jerry can of gas. What you doing, Karate Man? Gunny demanded. I think we should finish up disposing of those bodies. It seems wrong to me to just let them decompose, and we don't have time to bury them. Your heart's in the right place, Mark, but we don't know if we can really spare the gas, and I don't think we should send out any smoke signals that might give us away, Gunny explained. We can't just leave them here like this, Mark insisted. I don't think we have a choice, Gunny reasoned. Tell you what, if and we come back this way, and it looks like we don't need the extra gas, you can finish the job up. Sound okay? Yeah, that'll be okay. The men loaded back into their vehicles and the convoy resumed its course. The rest of the trip was uneventful. When they reached Manny's daughter's neighborhood, the neighborhood was blocked off with 2 18-wheelers. Dirt had been piled up beside the road on both sides, and there were men with rifles behind the piles. Mark stopped as soon as he saw the barricade. The rest of their convoy had bunched up once they'd cleared the city limits, and the trucks behind Mark had to slam on their brakes to keep from rear-ending the Jeep. The sudden appearance of 4 vehicles, coupled with the sound of squealing rubber, seemed to make the guardians of this urban area quite nervous. Mark got on the radio. I don't like the looks of this, he announced to those with other radios. Before anyone could answer him, a voice came from behind the roadblock. Don't move or you will be fired upon, it instructed. Tell us what you want. We're here to see my friend's daughter, Mark called. What's her name and address? I don't know. Just a minute. Mark started to use his radio. Yeah, right, mister. We haven't heard that one before. Now you and your friends back up real slow and head on down the road before we have to show you how we deal with unwelcome guests. No, really, let me ask your friend. No, really yourself. You have 30 seconds to be gone or we open fire. Manny, what's your daughter's name and address? Quick. Her name is Letty Washburn. I don't know her address. Her husband's name is Ed and their son's name is Robbie. Mark repeated Manny's answer to the voice. Just a minute, the voice called. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably no more than 15 seconds, the voice returned with, Okay, have the father walk up. No weapons and no funny business. Mark turned in his seat and waved at Manny to come up to the Jeep. When he stepped out of his truck, Mark told his friend what the voice had instructed. Manny left his rifle behind and walked up to the barricade with his hands out from both sides. When he reached his destination, Mark saw a head pop up from behind the dirt pile. It spoke briefly with Manny, and then Mark saw another man run into the neighborhood. Several minutes later, the man came running back with another man, a woman, and a small boy in tow. The woman and the boy sandwiched Manny in a giant hug. The man shook his head vigorously. A few seconds later, one of the big rigs started up and pulled forward. A man, who Mark guessed the voice belonged to, stepped out and waved the convoy through. When the Jeep pulled past the big truck, the man who had come back with the runner jumped into the back seat. "Hi, I'm Ed. Go on up and take the second left." He finished guiding them to his house, and then when everyone was there, introductions were made all around. Manny explained that they'd come to move the Austinites to his house if they wanted. Letty and Ed jumped at the invitation. They said that while they were getting by, they had to rely on others more than they'd like. The grocery stores were still operating, but the selection of food had grown more and more limited over the past few weeks. Ed didn't own any firearms, and he was unable to help with the security of their neighborhood. And while those who did had been quite nice and fair, they'd also set themselves as the executive committee over the community. They'd made the job assignments and decided what days trips to the store would be taken. Ed and Letty were tasked with helping procure and purify water for the neighborhood. The city water had stopped working 2 weeks after the burst. They were carrying water back from a creek about a half a mile away and then boiling it over outside wood fires. Each person was only allowed 10 gallons of water per week. When Manny asked Ed about his mother, the younger man's head dropped. "Mom died 2 days after the burst." "I'm so sorry," Manny emphasized. "What happened?" "I think the burst ruined her pacemaker. We found her in the flower garden with the bucket she used to water her plants. Her heart probably slipped out of rhythm, and without the pacemaker to regulate it." The man had tears in his eyes. Letty slipped her arm around her husband's waist and consoled him. After a minute, she asked her father what they needed to bring, but he gave her a quick list. The men from Silver Hills loaded the beds and the tables and chairs onto the trailer. Letty and Ed packed their clothes and the little food they had into the Suburban in the back of the truck. Letty also passed most of her cookware and some of her dinnerware. Ed had a few hand tools and a chainsaw in the garage that were loaded in the truck. Robbie, when told to pack some of his most important things, came out of his room with a box of toys. Lying on top was an electronic gaming system. His grandpa got a good laugh upon seeing the video game and explained to the boy that there was no electricity at his house either. The two of them went into the 9-year-old room and put the useless toy back. A minute later, Manny came walking up to Mark with something in his hands. "Mark, look, Robbie has a set of walkie-talkies. They're just like the ones Rodney gave us." Mark looked at them, and they really were FRS radios. He turned their switches, but only one of them came on. Robbie explained that he'd accidentally left the other one on and the batteries had run down. Mark asked if they could borrow them, and Robbie was glad to help out. Mark asked the family if they had anything else that might help. When nothing else could be thought of, everyone loaded into the vehicles, and the convoy headed out of the Washburns neighborhood. Ed spoke briefly with the men at the entrance before they turned toward Silver Hills. The trip home was uneventful, and except for stopping to burn the bodies at the roadblock, they made no stops. Joe spent most of the time during the trip home talking about how he and his wife were not getting along lately. He attributed it to the big adjustment they had made in their lifestyle since the burst. Mark listened for a while, but he soon had heard all of Joe's domestic problems he could stand. His mind kept wandering back to the attack on Ralph and his family. There was something about it that troubled him. He just couldn't put his finger on it, probably because all the whining that prevented him from focusing. He wanted to tell Joe to shut up, but he knew it would hurt the man's feelings. One thing he could focus on was the fact that he would find someone else to ride shotgun with him on the trip to Waco. When they got to the big gate, it was almost dark, and Charlie's shift had just come on. Jim was at the gate, and he opened it for the convoy. Mark pulled through far enough for all of the vehicles to enter. In his mirror, Jim saw John close the gate and then briefly speak with Gunny. Jim then made his way up to the Jeep. "Gunny said you all didn't have any problems." Mark nodded his head. "That's good. Unfortunately, I have some bad news." "What is it?" "Rodney died this afternoon. Lisa thinks it was a blood clot." Mark's heart fell to his stomach. He felt sad and angry all at the same time. "How's Donna?" "Not good. Lisa gave her something to calm her down and sent her to bed." Mark thanked his friend. He drove to Manny's house and was somewhat cheered up to see the happiness that his daughter's and grandson's homecoming had brought. After they had unloaded the trucks and trailer, Mark drove home. When he walked into the kitchen, Jess, Lisa, Abby, Alice, and George were there. The look on Jess's face told Mark that everyone was taking this badly. Mark looked at Lisa next. It was obvious she'd been crying a lot. Her face was all swollen and red. Mark had to ask the questions, but he waited for Gunny to arrive so that Lisa could relate the particulars just once. A few minutes later, the old man came in and asked what had happened. Lisa explained that she thought it was a pulmonary embolism, or in layman's terms, a blood clot that formed in his lungs, broke loose and moved to his heart. She started crying again as she explained. George told the guys that Shapara was building a casket and that they had tentatively scheduled the funeral for tomorrow afternoon. He had taken Abby and Alice down to talk to Brother Bob about performing the service, and he'd agreed. Mark asked about Donna, and Jess told him that she'd fallen apart. Lisa had given her some sedatives and sent her to rest. The boys were doing okay under the circumstances, although they had spent most of the day crying. They were now asleep with their mother in the tent.